we should talk about
Mm.
that. How much experience have you had in America and Canada and anywhere
Well,
else? Anywhere else? Ireland, for
all
example.
right. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story. So
Mm.
I set up this strategic asset management partnership with a couple of really, really good asset managers.
Mm.
They've gone on to do good things. Not one in Britain still and one in Canada, in fact.
Mm.
But while I was working there, and I got very involved in the Institute of Asset Management, and it was through that I met Jim Kennedy, and Jim Kennedy organised for me to come over and be
Yep.
an eminent speaker in 2004. And then I was invited to what was meant to be the first NAMS International
Mm.
Conference in Rotorua, which was where I met, maybe I had met Roger before, but anyway, Roger was there, Penny was there. And that was very, very interesting. New Zealand's very interesting.
Yes, it is.
And then I got invited, anyway, to do some consultancy for New South Wales Rail Corp. And out of that, I essentially then ended up getting a job in New South Wales Rail
Yeah.
Corp, which in 2006, I moved over to Sydney to work there.
Yeah.
Interesting experience. So I worked 5 years in Australia. I already knew Jim, Penny, Roger, and I got to know lots of other, John Hardwick, etc., and learnt tons. I mean, Sandy, I think I really learnt what asset management was in Australia. It was a fantastic experience. But then we wanted to go home because we had new grandchildren, or the whole thing. So we came back in 2010, and my mother was very elderly at that point, so I decided I was only going to work part-time, and I started teaching for AMCL. Now, AMCL had been it's quite impressive, AMCL, because it was started in 1997 in London, which is before anybody in England knew what asset management was. So it was an interesting kind of missionary sales consultancy, but it had a strong connection, things like what became Network Rail connections. And by the time I started doing work for AMCL, I guess there were about 20 people, something like that, which already made it quite a large independent asset management consultancy. And they were beginning to get an international reputation, partly through me. They got into Australia because I needed them to help me when I was in Sydney. And then they started sort of branching out. And in those first years, 2010, 11, 12, I got sent all over the world to teach asset management. My first thing I did with them was go to Bogota in Colombia.
Okay.
Possibly because nobody else wanted to go, but it was very, very interesting. Went back there a couple of times. So I taught in mainland China. I taught in New Zealand, which was a riot because I'm sure they knew more than I did. So I did get around Europe, Far East, enduring relationships with things like Indonesian state electricity. So I've seen quite a few different countries, different sectors, which is fantastic experience. Now, that wasn't quite what you asked me. The first question you asked me was, what had I had to do with North America? So and at some point I went full-time at AMCL after my mother died. And I was now
You were in Seattle.
trainer.
You were in Seattle.
Sorry?
You were in Seattle.
No.
Yeah? Okay.
I didn't move. No.
No.
No. I went full time. Yeah, I worked for MCL in London, but I was in 2015 for various 15, 16. We're really trying to set up a US office for AMCL, and at some point I decided I would much rather work in America than Britain for all sorts of reasons. And it's partly because I started teaching. I think the first course I taught there was 2012 for MTA, New York Subways, etc. in New York. And it just suited me. I kind of like working with Americans. And I decided that I was appreciated in America much, much earlier in their evolution. People really didn't know asset management. Even 2015, it was not common in America at all. So I felt again I was in at the ground floor in America, and I was kind of appreciated. They liked the way I taught. And so I decided to jump ship. I decided to join the beginnings of an American team based in New York. And then I got involved in some Ontario municipality training, a program of it in Ontario. After they changed the law to make asset management requirement. So I taught a lot of people in Ontario municipalities. So I have a fair knowledge of that. And since then, I've worked quite a lot with power in Canada and all sorts of people in America. So I'm part of the North America team. I don't live in North America. And when up until lockdown, I was traveling a lot in America on site. And then, of course, it's all remote now. So I feel I've had a very good ringside seat for the development of asset management in North America, in America. I said Canada already was more developed. And I've really enjoyed it. I've found asset management in the US. I mean, we don't work much in the middle. It's mostly West Coast.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed it. So I have a good network of mostly infrastructure asset management in the US, and I've really enjoyed it. I do travel to the US still. I'm going to Chattanooga for Tennessee Valley Authority in a few weeks, which is very exciting. I went to Newfoundland for the first time in January to teach the power company there. So it's interesting, and I'm interested in. We always said in the UK, it would be interesting if China picks up asset management because they'll do it a different way. That's also true of the US.
So big.
They're going to do things. Yeah. They're going to do it their own way too. But I've trained thousands of US people in asset management. So an awful lot of people in the US who do asset management were trained by me. So, and that was really fun.
I was on the WASA benchmarking, asset management benchmarking.
Oh, yes.
I was the first. We did basically the first benchmarking they had. I was a project manager, and I did some work in Seattle. The department
with Seattle Public Utilities.
Seattle Public Utilities.
Yeah. No, I've worked with them too.
And that was fascinating. Just to go
there. They're fascinating. Yeah, absolutely. No, I've worked a bit with them, and of course Roger went to Orange County, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Water in California, and worked with them with Brenton Marshall for years. And somebody else, Jeff Roder, who of course is a friend of mine, worked with BART, which is the Bay Area Rapid Transit in San Francisco. So we're starting to get that American connection on the West Coast, which was interesting, actually, very interesting to look at. Sometimes they didn't keep it up after Americans left, and they have had to re-find it. But I guess that sometimes people have to work it out a little bit for themselves. But
absolutely.
Interesting.
They do. They start. And then they
Hunter
find
Valley.
Hunter Valley.
Hunter Water were involved. I can't remember who it was with, whether it was in Seattle, but again, West Coast.
They were. Because when I did the actual Seattle utilities, one of the requirements was that one of their consultants actually sat in on it. And I said, no problems. And Hunter Water was obviously there at the time. So, that's how it all happened.
That's it.
All started.
Yeah.
But
so
it's fascinating. It's been fascinating. I worked in Manila. We did a job for Main and Lab Water, and that was a fascinating exercise. It was Manila Water and there was Main and Lab Water, and the families owned them, but it was just so fascinating because they had French consultants, and they wanted to sit in it on every meeting, and they wanted to argue the point and all the rest of it, and it was quite funny, but it was an interesting time because you never drive in Manila.
Did they have somebody like Veolia or Lyonnaise? Were Suez? Were they in Manila? Lyonnaise. Okay. Yes, of course. And they're great pain. I love them dearly, both of them. But they, of course, at one point were in the UK, and they were very They're funny. They were funny, controlling. Yes, exactly.
Very controlling.
So I can picture it. Yeah, exactly.
We had a session where they had the president of Main Lab, He had all these offsiders. There was about 20 of them around the table, and he had his consultant. And we raised the issue about spending capital dollars. And the Frenchman was aghast. No, we're not required to spend capital dollars. And we said, well, how are you going to return the assets in the same condition that you got them? And we got into this to and fro, and the president piped up and he says, we'll discuss this later. He basically said to the consultant, we'll discuss it later, because he wanted the money.
Interesting? Because many places in the world, asset management now seems to talk more about capital than it does about maintenance.
Yeah, absolutely.
In America, it's not particularly strong on maintenance. But yes, I know stories about Manila, but I think there had been something like Welsh Water, somebody from the UK.
There was all sorts.
Had a real bid to run the stuff, and they bankrupted them.
The history goes right back. It goes to the Spanish. It was the Spanish, Spanish. There was the Japanese, obviously after the war.
Yes.
There was the Americans, French, and then it was our turn. That's the way they put it.
It always sounds.
The Australians.
Somebody said, trying to run Manila Water was too much for anybody Western. Nobody had really a clue how to do it. So yes, no, I've never been to the Philippines, but
it was
I had good friends in Australia, of course, who were Filipino, because there's a good strong community there.
Culturally, it was interesting, and
yeah, I'm sure.
You got 5 rows of cars on 2 lanes, and it was really interesting. Look, no, we're not driving here. We're not driving.
Funnily enough, somebody told me a story yesterday. They said the same's true of Saudi Arabia. That if it's a 2-lane roundabout, there is 8 lanes, and I found that it was a little bit less chaotic, but you do have a lot of lanes on things like Beijing roads too. So it's just different, isn't it?
It is.
We're all quite well behaved on roads, but roads can be quite interesting.
It's very interesting. Yeah, the culture and everything. Yeah, they'd have sleep at their desk and all that sort of stuff, and they have their pet cats wandering around the building, and
really,
it was amazing. It was amazing. And
but I had very nice experiences teaching in both Malaysia and Indonesia. I think they're very civilized. I enjoyed very much working with them, and I still work with Indonesia. So I so appreciate the chance that I got to work in some of these places, I must say.
Yeah.
I really
enjoyed this video. Press the like button and subscribe. If you'd like to see more, please click on the Patreon link below and sign up.